In the early hours of February 28, 2026, the world crossed a line that many strategists had feared for decades, but few believed would ever truly happen. What began as a coordinated military campaign against Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure rapidly transformed into the single greatest geopolitical and economic shock of the 21st century. The operation was called Epic Fury, but for the global economy, it felt more like the beginning of controlled chaos. Within hours of the first strikes, oil prices exploded, global shipping routes froze, insurance markets collapsed, and one of the most important arteries of world trade, the Strait of Hormuz, became a battlefield. This was no longer just a Middle Eastern war. This was a systemic shock to the entire global order. And by the time the ceasefire was announced in April, the damage had already spread across every continent, every major industry, and nearly every household on Earth. The assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was expected by some planners to trigger regime collapse. Instead, it triggered something far more dangerous. Iran did not collapse. It decentralized. The country transformed into a network of asymmetric retaliation, driven by the IRGC, regional militias, proxy groups, cyber units, and drone warfare. Analysts began calling it the Houthification of the conflict. Iran could no longer dominate conventionally, but it could make the global economy bleed. And that is exactly what happened. Within 48 hours, Iran officially announced the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, located between Iran and Oman, carries nearly one-fifth of the world's oil and LNG shipments. For decades, economists described Hormuz as the world's most important energy choke point. In 2026, the world discovered why. Tankers stopped moving. Insurance companies withdrew coverage. Shipping firms panicked. And suddenly, the entire system of globalized trade, built on speed, efficiency, and just-in-time logistics, began to crack under pressure. One of the most shocking lessons from the war was that you don't actually need to sink ships to close a maritime corridor. You just need to make it commercially impossible to operate there. The Lloyd's Joint War Committee quickly labeled the Persian Gulf a high-risk zone. Insurance premiums skyrocketed overnight. For a modern oil tanker worth around $140 million, war risk insurance for a single voyage jumped from almost nothing to nearly $14 million. Most shipping companies simply refused to sail. And just like that, the Strait of Hormuz became a permission-based corridor. More than 1,500 commercial ships became stranded. Tens of thousands of sailors were trapped at sea, uncertain whether they would be allowed to leave, continue, or even survive. Shipping companies began rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa, adding thousands of miles and weeks of delay to global supply chains. Freight costs surged. Container shortages intensified. Ports became congested. The world economy, designed for precision timing, suddenly discovered how fragile it really was. But the biggest shock came from energy markets. Oil prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel. LNG prices in Asia jumped more than 140%. Diesel shortages hit logistics networks. Jet fuel prices devastated airlines and tourism industries. Electricity costs soared across Europe and Asia. From Bangkok to Berlin, ordinary people suddenly found themselves paying the price of a war happening thousands of kilometers away. And unlike previous oil crises, this disruption wasn't just about fear or speculation. Physical infrastructure was being destroyed. Iranian strikes targeted oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar. One of the most devastating attacks hit Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city, crippling nearly 17% of the country's LNG export capacity. That mattered because Qatar is one of the world's largest suppliers of liquefied natural gas. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and many European states depend heavily on those shipments. When the facilities were damaged, global energy markets lost not just supply, but confidence. The International Energy Agency called the crisis the greatest energy security challenge in modern history. Around 20 million barrels of petroleum products per day disappeared from global circulation. At the same time, 20% of global LNG trade became disrupted. Strategic petroleum reserves were opened. Emergency stockpiles were released. Governments tried everything to stabilize markets. But the reality was simple. The world economy was addicted to Gulf energy, and suddenly the supply chain was under attack. Interestingly, the United States weathered the storm better than many expected. America's position as a major energy exporter insulated it from complete disaster. Gasoline prices still surged domestically, but compared to Europe and Asia, the U.S. economy remained relatively resilient. In fact, the crisis accelerated a major shift in global energy flows. American oil exports surged as Europe and Asia desperately searched for alternatives to Middle Eastern supply. The Atlantic basin suddenly became far more important than the Gulf in determining global pricing power. But energy was only the beginning. Hidden beneath the headlines was another crisis slowly unfolding, a silent crisis involving fertilizers, chemicals, metals, and industrial gases. The Gulf region is not just an oil producer. It is also a critical hub for global manufacturing inputs. Fertilizers became one of the first major casualties. The region supplies nearly one-third of the world's traded ammonia, urea, and phosphate products. When exports collapsed, agricultural markets panicked. Farmers in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America suddenly faced shortages during key growing seasons. Food inflation surged, crop yields declined, and the consequences are likely to last years beyond the war itself. Then came the helium crisis. Most people rarely think about helium beyond balloons, but modern semiconductor manufacturing depends heavily on it. Qatar alone controls roughly 40% of global helium production. When those supplies became disrupted, semiconductor factories in Taiwan and South Korea began burning through emergency reserves. Production delays spread through the technology sector. AI chip manufacturing slowed. Medical imaging equipment became harder to produce. Even hospitals began worrying about supply shortages. A conflict in the Persian Gulf was now impacting advanced computing and healthcare systems on the other side of the planet. The war also revealed how deeply interconnected industrial supply chains truly are. Sulfur exports from the Gulf, critical for copper processing and chemical manufacturing, became constrained. Mining companies in Chile saw costs rise sharply. Aluminum production faced pressure. Petrochemical feedstocks became scarce. The world realized that globalization had created incredible efficiency, but very little resilience. And then came the macroeconomic contagion. Central banks across the world suddenly found themselves trapped. Inflation surged because energy and commodity prices exploded. But economic growth slowed at the exact same time because consumers and businesses were crushed by those higher costs. This was the return of a word that economists fear more than almost anything else: stagflation. The European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate cuts and raised inflation forecasts. Growth expectations collapsed. Germany's industrial sector, already weakened by earlier energy crises, faced renewed stress. The Eurozone moved dangerously close to stagnation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Federal Reserve faced a nightmare scenario: high inflation combined with slowing global demand. Bond markets sold off aggressively. The dollar surged as investors fled towards safe assets. But that stronger dollar created another problem. Emerging markets with dollar-denominated energy imports suddenly faced exploding costs in local currency terms. Countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Pakistan entered dangerous territory, facing potential balance of payments crises. For Iran itself, the economic devastation was catastrophic. The destruction of military and industrial infrastructure, combined with the naval blockade, effectively strangled the country's export economy. Oil shipments collapsed. Inflation spiraled towards 60%. Infrastructure failures became widespread. The Iranian regime survived, but as a heavily militarized war economy operating under extreme strain. Domestic unrest intensified, and the state responded with force. Israel also faced severe consequences. While its military remained operationally dominant, the country's high-tech sector, often called the engine of the Israeli economy, suffered major disruption. Nearly 20% of the tech workforce was mobilized into reserve duty. Startups lost funding. Product development stalled. International investors became nervous. Many companies began quietly considering relocating projects abroad to reduce geopolitical risk exposure. For a nation built heavily on innovation and global investment confidence, that represented a serious long-term challenge. Meanwhile, the Gulf Arab states discovered a brutal truth. Balancing between the United States, China, and Iran had become impossible. For years, countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar tried to pursue omni-alignment, maintaining security ties with Washington while deepening economic relations with Beijing and preserving cautious diplomacy with Tehran. The 2026 war shattered that strategy. Gulf states absorbed massive retaliation despite not directly controlling the conflict itself. Their infrastructure became targets in a war shaped largely by external powers. This triggered a major geopolitical realignment. Gulf states began demanding formal security guarantees instead of vague partnerships. New regional alignments started emerging, including cooperation between Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. China expanded its diplomatic role, positioning itself as a stabilizing broker rather than a military aggressor. Beijing's message resonated strongly in the region. America may still dominate militarily, but China offers economic continuity without direct intervention. At the same time, projects like the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor suddenly became strategically essential. The logic was clear. If the Strait of Hormuz could no longer be trusted, then the future of global trade required overland alternatives, railways, pipelines, and logistics corridors that bypass maritime choke points altogether. Infrastructure was no longer just economics. It was national security. Perhaps the most important long-term consequence of the war was the acceleration of the global energy transition. The 2026 crisis became a wake-up call. Governments realized that dependence on imported fossil fuels was not merely an economic issue, it was a geopolitical vulnerability. Europe launched aggressive renewable energy initiatives. Asian countries accelerated electric vehicle adoption. India doubled down on solar manufacturing and domestic energy capacity. Even countries previously committed to LNG expansion began reconsidering their strategies. Ironically, the war may have done more to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels than years of climate diplomacy ever could. High oil prices, energy insecurity, and geopolitical instability created a new narrative. Renewables were no longer just about saving the environment. They were about survival, sovereignty, and strategic independence. But the future remains uncertain. The ceasefire announced in April 2026 stopped the immediate violence, but it did not solve the underlying conflict. Negotiations remain stalled. Both sides maintain maximalist demands. The Strait of Hormuz remains technically open, but heavily militarized and economically risky. The war premium remains embedded in energy prices. And global markets continue operating under the assumption that escalation could return at any moment. Several possible futures now stand before the world. In one scenario, the conflict settles into a prolonged no war, no peace environment. Trade continues, but under constant tension. Inflation remains elevated. Growth stays weak. The global economy slowly adapts to a more fragmented and insecure world. In another scenario, China emerges as the dominant diplomatic and economic power in the Middle East, using infrastructure investment and energy partnerships to reshape the regional order. The United States remains militarily powerful, but increasingly viewed as a source of instability rather than stability. There is also the risk of renewed escalation. If conflict resumes and energy infrastructure suffers another wave of attacks, oil prices could surge even higher, potentially pushing the global economy into deep recession. And beneath all of this lies the terrifying wild card that policymakers rarely mention publicly: the risk of nuclear proliferation and a wider regional war. What makes the 2026 Iran-Israel war so historically significant is not just the military dimension. It is the fact that the war exposed the hidden architecture of globalization itself. For decades, the world optimized for efficiency. Supply chains became leaner. Shipping became faster. Energy systems became interconnected. But resilience was sacrificed in the process. And when one of the system's keynotes broke, the shockwaves spread everywhere. The war demonstrated that economic warfare in the 21st century is no longer limited to sanctions or tariffs. Insurance markets can become weapons. Supply chains can become battlefields. Ports, pipelines, semiconductors, fertilizers, and shipping routes are now instruments of geopolitical power. The modern global economy is not just interconnected, it is vulnerable. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of 2026. The post-Cold War era, the era of hyper-globalization, cheap energy, and stable trade routes, may now be ending. What comes next could be a world defined less by efficiency and more by strategic redundancy. Less by cooperation and more by regional blocs. Less by open globalization and more by controlled corridors shaped by military and political leverage. The full economic cost of the conflict still cannot be measured. It may take years before the real damage becomes clear. But one thing is already undeniable. The Iran-Israel War of 2026 was not just another regional conflict. It was a turning point in the history of the global system itself.